Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, Associate Director of Community Engagement and a professor in the Chicano Studies, Central American Studies, and the African American Studies Department. Today, we are continuing our book series to promote our worldly scholars and the amazing research they're doing. So with us today, we have Soraya de Chavarriaban, and she's a professor in the History Department as well as the Institute for Society and Genetics. And her brand new book, which is just amazing, is entitled Heredity Under the Microscope, Chromosomes and the Study of the Human Genome with the University of Chicago Press. Hello, Soraya, how are you today?
Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. So we're going to really get into why this is an important book and one that really everyone in and outside of academia should pick up. So can you tell us, kind of a little bit about the genesis here, and how did you come to decide to study the history of chromosomes?
So I wanted to work on something new, I think. So I studied the history of the life sciences. This is my main field. And I had worked a lot on the history of the molecular technologies that have come to dominate the life sciences in the 20th century. But with this project, I was going to study the people who were actually studying biology looking down the microscope. So the title, it maybe sounds like a pun, but it's actually the people who really look through the microscope. And also, I had never worked on questions of human heredity and on human genetics before. And this is a much more messy and much more complicated subject as the history of molecular biology, which, they worked for a long time in viruses and phages and bacteria to figure out some fundamental processes. But I now think it's a much more interesting field for that.
Thank you. So we're going to start broad and then kind of get in more details. So just kind of walk us through, what is the main argument of the book?
Yeah, so the main argument is really that this effort to study heredity by looking and counting chromosomes through the microscope was not just a kind of old-fashioned biology, but it really in decisive ways shaped how we think about genetics today, and so equally important as the molecular tradition that has taken so much of the limelight in the public perception of genetics, especially currently.
And what are some of these key findings that you're only really able to obtain by specifically researching chromosomes?
I think I take this question to mean, so what did I find out studying the history? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Because it's not, I'm not just, this is sort of a history book, right? So I think one of the findings I just mentioned, and that is that this kind of studying was important to shape how we think about heredity. But there are other findings as well. And so I should say, maybe give some of the background here. After World War II, human genetics had gotten into disrepute because of its implication with eugenics and with the racial policies and extermination politics of Nazi Germany. So the question then is, how can we explain the post-war resurgence of human genetics? And the answer I offer in the book is that the new concerns about the effects of atomic radiation on the humans in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and the embrace of atomic energy for military and civilian uses by various, mostly Western government at this point, offered new incentives to study human genetics. And to some extent, this argument had been made before, but what I show is that chromosome analysis really emerged as the right tool for the job, as the effects of radiation were directly visible on the chromosomes. And so this is in form of chromosome aberrations like breakages and fusions and ring formation. And so these could be quantified and used as dosimetric tests, for instance. But chromosome research also promised to provide insight into how radiation produced cancer, especially leukemia, that was dubbed also the pestilence of the atomic age because of its prevalence in atomic bomb survivors. And so in the eyes of its promoters, this new technology was really it provided a new and objective way to study human heredity and put the whole subject on a solid basis. Because what's there more objective than looking through the microscope, counting and measuring chromosomes? And so after the missteps of the past. And so also this role of visual evidence in making knowledge claims is another important topic in the book. And there are more equipment.
And I think this is a great segue, because often when we think about science, we think of it as extraordinarily very objective. And yet you also engage with the eugenics conversations, which are often socially and culturally based, and engage with a lot of problematic racial assumptions. What does your work in this specific book say about more of that social conversations around studying the genome?
Yeah, so the social context is very much present, but more specifically now on this eugenic question. Now, the eugenic question is really intricately, and some would say inextricably, linked to the questions of human heredity. But my aim, and so that's what I claim in the introduction, is actually to disentangle the two to a bit, to open up new questions of inquiry. So I think this one question has dominated so much of the historiography. And so I think there are other questions we should look at as well. And so I do hope I have managed to do this. So the whole question about atomic energy and genetics is one such question. But I also discuss, for instance, the introduction of chromosome analysis for gender testing in the competitive sports context, that then led to the discovery that chromosomes could not always predict gender, or in the courts following the observation, later dismissed, that a man with a specific chromosome set were more aggressive. This is a highly notorious case in the history of the field. So there were many. So these are fields, I think, the use of technology in the courts, that have not much to do with eugenics. At the same time, it is also true that the connections to the eugenic past always resurface. And one way in which this does show up, as you suggest, actually, is in the continued search for racial differences in the human genome. And so for chromosome researchers, these remained elusive. They never quite managed to pin them down, but they kept thinking that there must be something. And, and eventually, with the genomic, with new technologies, they also managed to see more of these differences. Another area where eugenics comes back through the back door, this is, as Troy Duster has mentioned, is in the field, of course, and not even so much through the back door, in prenatal diagnosis and the decisions associated with it, which became one of the most important applications of chromosome analysis. I mean, this is one technique that came in the mid-60s, late 60s, together with other technologies like amniocentesis and the abortion laws, but around these new chromosome technologies. And that's, of course, also one of these places where these decisions are made, right? What's worthwhile life and so on. We can connect this to see strong continuities to the eugenic movements, even if it comes along in other formats, right? Mm-hmm. Supposedly as choice.
Yes, and I think one of the things in reading the book, which was very empowering, to think about how women's choice is, as you were speaking, political when we start speaking about prenatal and abortion, but that science, that again is thought of as objective, also takes on these relevant cultural and social norms. So I also wanted to ask you, again, you looked at this through a historical perspective. So thinking about how does understanding that history of chromosomes and molecular biology help us understand contemporary debates? Often people are now doing a lot of research on DNA and genetics. So help us understand how your work engages with that contemporary work.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to take this as a more general question, right? What can we learn by looking at history? And I really think strongly, that this that it does help us a lot to understand the present, so that we do history very much also to understand the present, and I think it shows us that the question we pose, the questions, the tools, the infrastructures, the institutions, they all have their history, and they are intimately also woven together, and so really shape the knowledge that is made, right? So this cultural understanding of how science works. And then also it helps us, I think, maybe to be a bit more modest with our claims at what is new and progress and so on, because it's most likely that looking 50 years on, what we think now, is at the frontier, will be revised. And this is, I think, important to think especially in the context of science, history of science. And finally, I think the history can also show us maybe avenues of research that were discussed but then forgotten or put aside for a variety of reasons, but that which actually may point us to new questions and new perspectives on current problems. And now in the case of genomics, it's actually very striking that many of the questions discussed now in the context of genomics, for instance, how meaningful are all the changes we find, right? So there's big discussions that we should all at birth now get a full readout of our genome. And there's a lot of stuff, so we can't even understand it, right? So how much of this should be shared, and what is the meaning of it, and what is ethical? What makes us human? And these are all questions that were very much debated by the cytogeneticists 50 years ago. And so we may also learn from this experience, at least to avoid falling into some of the same pitfalls. So I think on many levels, doing history, it provides a historical lens to current events, right? Which I think is very helpful, connecting it to the past and to the future.
So you've already spoken about this a little bit, but this is a little bit probably for more scholars out there, graduate students, but also to help the public understand that part of the reason scholars like yourself at UCLA are so cutting edge is because you take on an interdisciplinary approach, methodology. You're not solely looking at science, solely looking at history, solely looking at this sociological outcomes. It's truly that interdisciplinary lens that allows you to have a more comprehensive view. So can you tell us a little bit about how the specific contributions of the book and your findings are in part because of that interdisciplinary approach?
Yeah, so I think this is actually I like to answer this question. So my field is really the history of science, right? But I'm in the history department, at least half of me. And so I like really to point out that the book, even if it has the word chromosomes in the title, right, is not really it's not a science book. It is a history book, right? And it's also not very technical. So having some biological background, let's say high school biology, is helpful. But it's really not a prerequisite, I think, to get something out of the book, right? So, because I often get these comments, right? Oh, this sounds very interesting, but, I don't understand it. So I don't think one should take, I think everyone living today, is confronted with so much about genetics and what it means and what it defines in so many fields, from the medical to, I don't know, to law, to so many fields where it plays a role that we have all to become a little literate.
And I think that
it's not a science book, it really has to place this into the cultural context.
And perhaps that's precisely why, it is important for more folk to be able to understand this, that you're able to have a book that's accessible and people really be able to understand the multiplicity of all this. So the last question I have for you, Soraya, is tell us why this is a great choice for professors to assign this book in their class.
Good. So I think, I hope it's readable. I think it provides an introduction and a new perspective on the development of human genetics for the post-1945 period, with connection to the eugenic past and the current genomics, with all the implications we have already touched upon. And so I think it should be of interest to anyone who seeks to answer how in the 20th century, to answer the question, how in the 20th century genetics explanation have become so important in defining who we are, but then also the problems with this. And so if one is curious about that question, then I think the book will provide some answers. Or will be at least thought-provoking.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people in and outside of academia are definitely excited about these topics. So again, I want to say thank you to Soraya. This is Celia Lacayo. Please make sure to subscribe to LA Social Science, and we will continue to bring you the most cutting edge and best scholarship out there. Thank you again, Soraya.
Thank you.
And we'll catch you all soon again. Thank you.